So let's talk about something really important. Whether you're a landlord or a tenant in Nigeria, what happens when things get complicated? You know, the rules of the game are super specific. It's not as simple as just changing the locks. So today, we're going to break down the official, step-by-step legal process for eviction.
I mean, think about it. The landlord-tenant relationship is one of the most common ones we have, right? But what happens when that relationship sours? When things just go wrong? Can a landlord just decide they've had enough, show up, and change the locks? Well, the answer is a big fat no. In Nigeria, there's a very specific legal path that absolutely must be followed.
All right, so here's our game plan for today. We'll touch on the foundation of it all, walk through the first step, the final warning, how the courts get involved, and then how to find a path to harmony.
Okay, first up, the foundation. Before we can even get into eviction notices, we've got to understand the ground rules. This is the bedrock, and everything else is built right on top of it.
You know, at its heart, this whole thing is about interdependence. It's a two-way street. One person needs a place to live, and the other needs a return on their property investment. So to make sure this all works smoothly, the law sets up a really clear structure. It gives both sides specific rights and duties, and it's all designed to keep things fair and balanced.
And this brings us to a huge, absolutely critical point. Once that tenancy agreement is signed, a tenant has a legal right to be there. A landlord can't just wake up one morning and say, you know what, I'm done. Nope. There's a mandatory legal process, and it's there for a reason, to provide stability and to stop anyone from misusing their power.
All right, so let's say a landlord does need to end a tenancy. What's the very first official legal thing they have to do? Well, it all kicks off with something called a quit notice.
So before we really dig into what a quit notice is, let's just zoom out for a second and look at the whole journey. It's basically a four-step process. You've got the quit notice, then the notice of intention. If the tenant still hasn't left, it's on to court action, and that can lead to a final court order. Pretty straightforward, right?
So what exactly is a quit notice? Well, let me tell you what it's not. It's not a text message. It's not a quick phone call. It is a formal, written, legal document. It's the official way a landlord says, I intend to end our agreement and I need my property back. And the amount of notice you have to give usually depends on the type of tenancy. Like you might give a week's notice for a weekly rental or a month's notice for a monthly one.
And look, this notice is so much more than just a piece of paper. It's actually a reflection of the law's core values. It's about fairness. It's about giving tenants a reasonable amount of time to find a new home. And really, it's about upholding basic human dignity. No one should be kicked out of their home suddenly or without respect.
Okay, but what if that quit notice comes and goes, and the tenant is still there? You might think the next step is court, right? Well, not so fast. The law actually requires a second, even more serious warning.
Yeah, it's called the Notice of Owner's Intention to Recover Possession. I know, it's a total mouthful. But what it means is actually crystal clear. It's the landlord's final warning, and it basically says, hey, the first notice expired. If you don't leave now, the very next thing I'm doing is filing a lawsuit.
The whole point of this step is total transparency. No surprises, no ambiguity. The landlord is laying all their cards on the table. And honestly, this notice is really designed to prevent a court case. Because once a tenant sees that a lawsuit is definitely coming next, that's usually enough to get them to vacate voluntarily. But what happens if both notices have been served and the tenant is still there? Well, this is the point where the landlord has to step back. Now the judicial system comes in to act as a neutral referee and make sure justice is served.
So, what does the court do? It basically looks at two main things. First, it looks at the landlord's actions. Did they follow every single step of the law correctly? Were the notices served properly? Then, the court listens to the tenant's side of the story. Is there a valid legal reason they're still there? The decision isn't based on who tells a better story. It's based strictly on the law and the evidence.
And this next point, it gets right to the absolute heart of why this process exists. A quote from our source material says it all. Eviction must be carried out under judicial supervision rather than through force or intimidation. Let that sink in. That means no self-help, no changing the locks, no turning off the water, no intimidation tactics. It's a fundamental, non-negotiable principle of the law.
So, the court's process is actually pretty logical. First, they examine all the evidence from both the landlord and the tenant. Then, they figure out if the tenancy was lawfully ended, based on all those steps we just talked about. And if the answer is yes, the court grants something called an order for possession. That's the official document that legally authorizes the eviction.
Okay, so we've walked through the whole legal process for when things go wrong. But let's switch gears. Let's talk about how to make sure things go right from the very beginning. How do we build a real path to harmony?
You know, when you boil it all down, it comes back to that simple balance of rights and responsibilities. It really is a two-way street. A landlord has a responsibility to respect the tenant's right to peaceful enjoyment of their home and, of course, to follow the law. And on the flip side, the tenant has responsibilities too. Pay the rent on time, respect the property, and stick to the agreement.
And here's the thing. So many of these messy conflicts can be avoided from the get-go. The keys are actually pretty simple, but they're incredibly powerful. Things like maintaining open communication, having a super clear written agreement, keeping great records of payments, and, this is a big one, tackling small problems before they blow up into huge ones. That's the secret sauce to a healthy, professional relationship.
So when you look at the big picture, this entire legal framework we've been talking about is really about one thing: balance. It's a system carefully designed to protect a landlord's property rights, for sure, but also to safeguard a tenant from being unfairly or suddenly thrown out on the street. It's all about finding that middle ground to ensure fairness for everyone involved.
And that kind of brings us to our final thought. The law gives us the rule book, right? But rules are just the starting line. What truly builds a better, more harmonious housing system for everyone? It's got to be things like mutual respect, genuine understanding, and good communication. So, I'll leave you with this to think about. Beyond the law, what do you think is the single most important ingredient for creating that harmony? Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer.